Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans. Welcome to Myth and Magic. Writing is an infinite process, don't you think? Writing is a transition infinite process. But what about everything else? Well, it turns out that everything else is unreal. Because reality is not a thing, but it's a process. Reality is a transition infinite process. Reality is a Mobius strip that goes around and around and on forever. Reality is eternally looping on itself, as if it's seeking some kind of end point, though it never properly arrives. As you roll out the words of your novel, some days the words will come easily to you, some days the words will not come at all. But as you endlessly roll out those words, it must have occurred to you by now that a book is a process rather than a thing. And when you start the editing bit of the process, if you haven't already, you'll become even more convinced that a book writing journey never properly ends. It simply rattles jerkily along, hardly moving anywhere at times, or moving so slowly you can't be sure it's not entirely accomplished. But then it jolts into life again, improving and growing and developing, although one can never be sure. And all that we do know about book writing, all that's indisputable about book writing, is that a satisfying conclusion can never be reached. Don't be fooled. Just because you wrote a final version and sent it to a publisher or a printer, having completed a perfect final chapter and having already completed rewrites and rereads, it doesn't mean it's the end, because there is no end. There's no end to the book writing journey, because after the slow drift of editing, and incidentally editing proceeds at the speed of cooling tectonic plates, I expect you already know that, but after the slow drift of editing, there's the book launch and the first sales, and then the reviews. And guess what? When others see your book, they'll make comments. And you must address those comments, and then that will require more editing. And even when you finish writing a book, it isn't over. The procedures go on, others poke their nose in, keen to improve, and so it goes, on and on, forever. Book writing isn't a thing. It's a process, a transition infinite process. The ancient Greeks thought that the basic nature of all things is change. The basic nature of all things is change. Therefore, reality is not a thing, but a set of infinite processes. For example, a river is not an object, but a process of flow. A sun is not an object, but a process of conflagration. And a book is not an object, but a process of drafting. As an author, you'll know that strife and conflict are the primary reasons for change in a novel, because that's what motivates a good plot. But take the idea of life. Life is not a thing, it's a process with bits of strife and conflict along the way to make things interesting. Or take love. Love is not a thing. Love is a process with bits of strife and conflict along the way to make things interesting. Or take humanity. Humanity isn't a thing. It's a process with bits of strife and conflict along the way to make things interesting. Am I getting through? Take fitness. A process with bits of strife and conflict along the way to make things interesting. Take knowledge. A process with bits of strife and conflict along the way to make things interesting, and so on. It makes sense, doesn't it, that non-physical and non-material things intangibles, if you like, are processes rather than real and actual things. But it's harder for us to acknowledge that the things we bash, the things we buy, the things we sit upon, the things we wear on our head, the things we eat, the things we build with, all these are also processes. They are not permanent, they are not real, and they're not actual things. Now, this sort of wobble-headed unclearness will require some springboard into intellectual peculiarness, won't it? But last week I spoke about the Göbekli Tepe, which is the oldest stone structures in the world. But I forgot to tell you that the Mesolithic people who built those extraordinary monuments chose stones that they knew would last longer than all the other building materials they had available. Perhaps they chose those stones instinctively, perhaps they chose those stones analytically. Nobody will never know. Yet even the ancient stones of a Göbekli Tepe won't last forever. In fact, modern archaeologists are already correcting those stones. They're already recovering and realigning bits of structure, and they're rebuilding the circles. So modern archaeologists are now part of the transition infinite process. So, like a book, like your book, the monument at Göbekli Tepe goes on and on. It's never going to be completed because it's always being redrafted. This argument seems to suit the Buddhist doctrine that states all is transient, evanescent, inconstant. All is transient, evanescent, inconstant. And to define those a little bit easier for you, transience is that nothing ever reaches a permanent state. Evanescence is that everything passes through phases, and inconstance is everything frequently changes, it's always shifting. If you look at your face in the mirror, you may confidently recognise yourself, but the skin cells that live on your face have only existed there for the last 2 or 3 weeks. Before that, there were other skin cells that lived there, and those ones that you see today will be replaced by others in 3 weeks' time. The person you look at today is an entirely different version of you that you saw 4 weeks ago. But worse than that, the person you look at today is an entirely different person altogether than the person who sits in front of the mirror 10 years ago. We replace our skeletal muscles every 15 years. We replace our entire body skeleton every 10 years. Even little things like an eyelash. It takes 6 weeks for an eyelash to grow and fall out, though an eyelash goes through a resting phase known as a telogen phase, when they remain almost unchanging, but then they move on. Brain cells last longer than other cells, and scientists think they might last about 30 years. But we replace our red blood cells every 4 months. Our bodies replace billions of cells every single day. We are the perfect shapeshifters. And yet, we recognise ourselves in the mirror. It's perhaps because of this uncanny skill that we have of being able to recognise ourselves as conscious and living that makes us think we are a thing. But, you've guessed it, we are not a real and actual thing. Like everything, we are transient, we are evanescent, we are inconstant, we are nothing and we are everything because we are transitions in infinite process. The reason it's worth pondering the incorporeal nature of existence and the wobbliness of reality is that you, as a fantasy author, will be dealing with paradoxes and with ambiguities and with monstrosities and transfigurations and incongruities and precognitions and all kinds of weird ultra-mundane supernaturalism in your work. So perhaps at times you will become distracted and even confounded by the boundless mystery of it all. And if that's the case, and you get rabbit punched by the sheer nebulousness of what you're writing, just look in the mirror. Remind yourself that everything is viable, though nothing is real. And that includes the author who's looking back at you, because you're every bit as weird as the werewolf. and every bit as weird as the zombie, and every bit as weird as the vampire and the elf, and even the diaphanous fluttery halfling that you just created out of your own imagination. Because we're all transitions in infinite process. Good luck with your transitions today. How to get creative in your writing. Become a proactive adventurer. I guess you know by now that in the next few weeks I'm going to launch a series of creative exercises for fiction writers. The good news is that the course will be delivered for free on my social media. All you have to do is come along and watch me make an idiot of myself. But to get you into the mood of creation, this week on Myth and Magic I want to talk about discovery and about its role in creative thinking. What does discovery mean to you? Does it mean that discoveries are acquired through our senses? Does it mean that discoveries are assimilated? In other words, they merge with pre-existing knowledge and experience? Does it mean that discoveries are about questioning things, and perhaps questioning is a major component of good discovery? Is it that discovery is about exploration, and is exploration the other main component in good discovery? And does chance play any part in discovery? Because many observers suggest that chance plays an important part. Well, I will look at some of those components in a little while, but first I want to tackle the role of chance in discovery, and I like to spell that, by the way, R-O-L-L, role of chance. There's a generally held belief that discoveries only occur through happy accident. This is as if Louis Pasteur was on holiday with his wife, perhaps caravanning in Norfolk, and while he was out walking one day through a cowfield, he accidentally discovered vaccination and microbial fermentation and pasteurisation. And of course, that's rubbish. And I dispute the suggestion wholeheartedly that chance is involved in discovery. And I want to tell you why. Louis Pasteur worked long hours in laboratories. He used sophisticated equipment. He'd trained before his discoveries as a mathematician, and then as a physicist, and later as a chemist before he became the world's first microbiologist. He had a team of experts who worked with him, and they all worked passionately under his command, and with logical deduction they came across their discoveries. It was not by chance. Or let's do a quick case study of Captain James Cook, the man who discovered Australia and the Great Barrier Reef. Was he sitting in his conservatory playing checkers with his housemaid when he made those discoveries? Well, of course not. No, he'd already served as an able seaman and a seamaster's mate on board warships. He'd already taken part in the daring capture of a French warship and the sinking of another, and these adventures led to his promotion. And he'd taken navigation and boat handling courses at the university run by the Admiralty, and he gained relevant qualifications in those skills. And after that study, he took part in a successful amphibious landing, one of the first amphibious landings, where he commanded men and vessels and helped with specialist cartography. And that event led him to study map making and surveying, including underwater surveying in greater detail. And thanks to these new skills, he became tasked with a mission to survey the jagged coastlines of Labrador and Newfoundland. And while in Newfoundland, Cook conducted astronomical observations of an eclipse of the sun, and it was this work that gave him the attention of the Admiralty and the Royal Society. And on the strength of his skills in astronomy and in map making, and no doubt due to his bravery and commitment, they put him in command of a scientific voyage to the Pacific Ocean aboard the HMS Endeavour, which was a warship. Cook sailed thousands of miles across uncharted seas, across the globe, to make those discoveries. So don't tell me that the role of chance is part of discovery. It is not. It is never an accident, even a happy accident. And it's the same story across the history of breakthroughs, from Johannes Kepler and his discovery of the third law of planetary motion, to Galileo's discovery of the laws of the falling body, right through to the Human Genome Project, the discovery of exotic hadrons, and the first ever image of the black hole that had been captured. All these were never random acts of luck. They were never based on a roll of chance, but these discoveries were made by thinkers who had adequately prepared themselves for success and were, above all, proactive. It's true that these thinkers had unblocked and freed and unravelled themselves from conventional wisdom to make such amazing and baffling breakthroughs. But here's the thing, and it's the thing that's overlooked by many. Those pioneers, all of the ones I just mentioned, anticipated success. I don't mean this in a groovy hippie, serenity spa, transcendental mindfulness way. I don't think really that these people were even very gentle. They weren't meek, that's for sure. They weren't meek folk filled with sweet and loving kindness. They weren't puffing on herbal cigarettes before practicing contemplation techniques to wow music. No, these people were tough, they were defiant, they were probably arrogant, they were very ambitious, they were jam-packed with charisma, which was marked perhaps by overconfidence, but certainly with a determination to get the job done, because they anticipated success when others did not. I have a lucky Irish friend, his name is George, and I once asked him, "Do you believe in the luck of the Irish?" He said, "Oh yes, but it doesn't work the way you think it works." So I said, "Is it not magic?" He said, "Oh no, the Irish tend to make their own luck. We prepare and plan our luck, you see, and then luck, she comes looking for us." In one of my recent occupations, during a long lifetime of diverse vocations and disciplines, my management in a team which they called the proactive team, my management emphasised the word proactive. And they emphasised it in our performance reviews, and managers would judge us on being either very proactive or moderately proactive or not proactive enough. And I think I was often put in the overly proactive column. I know I shouldn't brag, but I'm just telling you. Interestingly, no one else I ever worked for has used the word proactive in their performance reviews or in coaching and mentoring sessions. And it seems, therefore, that they don't value proactivity. But what is proactivity? Well, being proactive is taking charge of creation. That's all it is. It's about controlling situations rather than simply responding to them. One of my favourite definitions of proactivity is this: proactivity is a self-initiated behaviour that strives to solve a problem before it occurs. In other words, being proactive means thinking ahead and focusing on the things that you can control rather than worrying about the things that you can't. Looking back at Captain James Cook, do you see how his life was an accumulation of all the skills and all the competencies and all the credentials that he would eventually need if he wanted to discover Australia? As my Irish friend would say, Captain Cook made his own luck. So, the first thing to understand about discovery is that you need to be proactive. You need to go and find what you're dreaming about. And you need to build the skills that you'll need for that challenge. And this is as true for fiction writers as it is for scientists and for seafarers and for space explorers. The second thing to come to terms with, and it's obvious, but some don't see it, but the second thing is that we can only discover what is already there. The Dutch explorer Janszoon and the Portuguese sailor Mendonça landed on the Australian coast long before Captain Cook. And what about the indigenous Australians? They must have sailed there 10,000 years before Captain Cook. So of course Australia was there before Cook discovered it. Of course it was. The difference between his discovery and everybody else's, though, was that he made the place real. He put a flag in the ground, he sketched it, he mapped it, he wrote about it, he measured it, and he brought news home about it. He promoted it. He made it real. Do you need to be an intrepid discoverer and an adventurous thinker to be a fiction writer? Well, yes, I think that you do. Because someone has to write the first gaslight fantasy. Was that Bram Stoker? Who incidentally has a link with Captain Cook. Do you know what the link is? And someone has to write the first monster story. Was that Mary Shelley? And she's got a link with Bram Stoker, has she? And someone has to write the first techno thriller. And was that Michael Crichton? And somebody has to write the first Bangsian fantasy, and that obviously was John Bangs. Somebody has to write the first diesel pump. All these writers are discoverers because they have found something that was already there and then been proactive about it by sketching it, by mapping it, by writing about it, by bringing news home about it, and by promoting it. So if you want to be more like Stoker and Shelley and Crichton and Bangs, you need to be a proactive, adventurous writer. So here are 9 ways to become a proactive, adventurous writer, as opposed to a discovery writer, by the way, which is quite the opposite. So here are 9 ways to be more like Stoker, Shelley, Crichton and Bangs. Number 1, challenge your own assumptions. Now you'll need to see my earlier blog about the para-other, and it's also on the Myth and Magic podcast. And in that I discussed how to explore your para-otherness, what a para-other is, but also how to explore your para-otherness for potential ideas. Number 2, challenge everyone else's assumptions. Ask yourself, why does society not like this thing? Why haven't they researched it? What are they saying about this sort of thing? What does society like or dislike about it? Research the reasons for those inclinations that society have for the thing. Why have some ideas, for example, been labelled as unpleasant or unacceptable or impractical? So challenge everybody else's assumptions. And recognise the difference between random things. So, for example, the front of something is known as a face. But why isn't there a functional antonym for the word face? Is it because we are scared to look behind the face? And by the way, that's also challenging everybody else's assumptions. And number 4, recognise similarities between random things. So polyphemus moths and peacocks and Air Force fighter jets all have eyes on their wings. But why is that? They'll tell you the reasons for each of them, but why do they all have them? Is it because jets want to mate with other jets? Or are moths scared they might be shot down by ally moths? And do peacocks want to imitate owls? And make unlikely connections. So, for example, if tree kangaroos live in the trees, why don't wombats live underwater? And build on one idea to provide another, newer idea. So, for example, moles eat worms, so why isn't there an underground predator that eats moles? Or perhaps there is, we just haven't discovered the predator yet. And look at things from a skewed perspective. Use a virtual periscope to look at the world from below the surface. Try to conceptually squint or block out the fringes of an idea to see the close-up details of something. And take advantage of the unexpected, and when the unexpected arrives, grab it with both hands. Captain Cook didn't want to find the Great Barrier Reef, he crashed into it. He literally crashed into it. It took him 6 weeks of repairs to fix his boat, but he had taken advantage of the unexpected. He used that 6 weeks to sketch it out. And number 9 is take chances. Take a chance with everything you do and be an adventurous writer. Good luck with your discoveries, and I'll speak to you soon.